get started. It's great to be here in New York and on the world stage, I guess. My name is Dedham with Mainline. I travel the country talking to customers about data protection as well as data preservation, and also focus on Tivoli Storage Manager. My colleague Randy Larson, who I work with, you might have worked with him in the past. He was with IBM for a long time, and he spent a good portion of his career at Mainline, or excuse me, with IBM, working with TSM. So he's made some contributions to this document that we're going to talk about. The agenda is first some food for thought. I want to share my experiences and observations that I've had with our customers as it relates to upgrading to TSM version 6. So I saw there was some V5 customers out here that this might be of use. And then we're going to get into some details of TSM version 6.2 and some of our experiences and hints and tips. So for the version 6 customers, there should be some nice nuggets for you. Hopefully a little bit for everyone here. So when we talk about upgrading, Yogi Berra say, when you get to a fork in the road, take it. And the fork here is, do I put a new environment in, or do I upgrade the existing environment? The prevailing wind has been to put a new environment in, build a whole new infrastructure. Of course, the factor there is, do you have the budget to fund that parallel infrastructure that has to go in place? And oftentimes that's not the case. As a result, you have to do an in-place upgrade or a network upgrade of the existing version 5 system. In some cases, we'll see a hybrid where there'll be a version 6 system that'll go in, and it'll be the library manager, and it will share the resources between the old version 5 and the new version 6. To me, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to refresh the TSM architecture, because, as I said, I travel a lot and work with customers doing assessments and health checks. And 9 times out of 10, the situation is customers are trying to put 20 pounds of potatoes in a 10-pound bag. And as a result, even if you move from version 5 to version 6, you're still in that same situation. And you may not be meeting your SLAs. Most of the time, you're not meeting your backup windows. And as Zoran said earlier, the whole reason we back up is to do restores. And SLAs are becoming more and more critical in the environment as we get into a service-oriented architecture. So this is an opportunity not just to look at what you need to run version 6, but maybe some of the tape and the disk that's also necessary, or the network that needs to get the backups done. Certainly when you're using existing infrastructure, it's more cost effective, but there are some upgrades you have to do because there's different requirements for the version 6 software, which we'll talk about. Considerations when you go to a net new TSM server, well, you got to go through a transition period. You're going to have these parallel environments. The idea is you'll be able to age off the existing version 5, but you'll be in that transition period, kind of managing both. You have to do full backups all over again, so that could be a significant workload that you're going to have to digest to get over. Invariably, there's what I call archive data out in the version 5 environment that has to be moved over, and there's techniques for doing that because you don't want to keep that version 5 infrastructure around forever. So we can do export import, or there's a service, I guess you could call it, from IBM called Butterfly, which will allow you to do it's very nice. You can do an upgrade from version 5 to version 6 without any downtime, 1. 2, it gives you the capability to reorganize your TSM policies and procedures and things that maybe you weren't able to do before because you inherited the system. So it's that proverbial greenfield. Right now you can go in and really redesign it the way you think it should be optimal for your organization. Of course, the issue with the version 5 is just usually the downtime. the first thing we typically look at is how big the database is, and then that will prescribe whether you're going to miss one backup cycle or not. Most customers, if we can do it within one backup cycle, they're okay, but if it's going to go beyond that, then we have to look at alternatives. Then the other question that comes up is, should I do the capacity license model or the PVU model that Orm was talking about? And this is where you got to look at what I found is important is as you're doing this evaluation and moving to the version 6 code, what are some of the products that you might be able to take advantage of that you're not doing today? If there's only one or two on that list, it may be hard to justify the capacity model. TSM for VE, Oren has talked about, that's a huge winner for customers. It's saving a lot of pain. TSM for databases. In the past, a lot of customers, the DBAs would just dump the backups onto the tier 1 disk and then scrape it up with the BA client through a script. And the reason they did it that way is because they couldn't afford the TDP. Well, now it would be affordable. Right? ERP, mail, SAN. Certainly we're seeing a lot of congestion on the networks, on the local area networks, so going LAN free to back up a multi-terabyte database in a timely manner is the way to go. And then fastback. Warren talked about fastback. I'm a big fan of this product. I think you're going to see a significant shift from file-based backup to block-based backup over the upcoming years. I heard some cheers about the JBB for Linux. And what are you addressing? You're addressing file systems with millions and millions and millions of objects. And it's simply difficult for any product to walk through that file system and figure out what it has to back up. Using a block level approach, it takes it off the table. What's not in the bundle? I always get this question. Well, the TVMR, the Tivoli Bare Machine Recovery, which is the Christie, TSM for SharePoint, Flash Copy Manager, and the SysBack for AIX. So what we've been doing is saying, okay, first of all, look at, are there additional products on that list that you can take advantage of? That's step one. Step two is, since the capacity model is based on your primary storage pool, let's look at the size of the pools, right? Furthermore, let's see if there's something that we could do to maybe shrink the size of that pool. When you run the macro, what it does is it strips out any active data, the ADP, strips out the virtual volumes, any data from SharePoint, and the HSM. Of course, these correspond to the products that are not part of the bundle. But I think what's a greater hit for you is seeing about what I call the inactive data. This is an example of one customer where when we do an assessment, one of the reports is the node backup currency. This is simply stating that over 20% of the nodes have not been backed up in a year or more. Now, you might be stunned with this next statement that this is kind of the norm that I see with TSM environments. And you're thinking, how could that be? Well, it's intentional, is the reason. This happens because machines are being backed up, they get decommissioned, new machines come in, and the TSM administrator is not in a position to delete those file spaces and nodes. And there isn't any communication or data governance model that flushes those systems out, or that old data. So what you have is this buildup of stale data in these storage pools. We had one customer recently was looking at the capacity model, and just through some very topical digging around, we were able to eliminate 500 terabytes worth of capacity. Now, I don't do a lot of pricing, but something tells me that could add up to some nice dollars. It was well worth the exercise. Point. And so you say, well, wait a second, maybe I can't get rid of it. Right? Maybe you've got something in place that says I have to keep this. So one of the things we've been talking about is looking at implementing a dedicated archiving server that would not be counted as part of this primary pool capacity. We used to recommend a separate archiving server with TSM version 5 because if you had a lot of archive data, it meant you were tracking a lot of files and your database would grow and get very large, and it would impact your ability to, for everything, right? The larger the database gets, the slower things run. If you're doing DR and you got to restore a 300 gig database, it would take a long time. And turns out a lot of that data you wouldn't need for DR, right? So as a strategy, we would typically prescribe a dedicated archive and backup server. But now I see yet another reason, even though the DB2 database can scale a lot higher and the object count that Oren was talking about is just amazing, this will help on the cost curve because now you can have your archives counted differently, and that will save your capacity license. I talked about if you're trying to put 20 pounds of potatoes in a 10-pound bag, that's not going to change by just updating your TSM executables. I'm a big believer in doing a health check, well, doing them periodically, but doing an assessment before you make the move. Some customers will say, well, why do I want to do a health check on a system that I'm replacing? Well, the reason is because the idea is we're not just changing out the code base. We want to look at opportunities to optimize and improve the environment. You know, this New York skyline is a very typical depiction of how most TSM servers are running in customer environments. You have backups going outside their backup window. You have backups overlapping with the admin processing jobs. In addition, you have certain admin processing jobs overlapping one another. And that can be bad. In this example here, the customer is actually backing up the TSM database while they're creating their copy storage pool. Right? And most of the time, it's not the fault of the TSM administrator. It's just there are not enough resources to get the work done in that fixed 24-hour window that we all have to live by. So in this case, because of this type of activity, there was a lot of issues on the back end, right? We didn't have enough mount points. They didn't have enough disk space, so they were constantly overflowing, had to rely on the back end tape drives, which were too few to deal with all of the backup jobs. Media wouldn't be available for various operations because they were being used for something else. The recovery log was not scalable enough. Right? 12 gig couldn't handle all of some of the long-running database backups, and it was getting pinned. And then disk book capacity. So kind of fast forward, and right, all you can do is go up. Right? You can't go horizontal because we're capped at 24 hours. But as you can see, if you put in the right infrastructure, you can move things aside. You can now have the proper sequence of the admin jobs. You can do you can use the maintenance script and serialize your admin operations so they're not overlapping. You can have a very healthy environment. And it gets you in the black, right? You go through a remediation effort, and we get to zero failures. Now, have I seen customers with this picture upgrade from 5 to 6 and still look this way? Yes. So that's why you got to look at it holistically, I would say, with the other pieces that are part of the environment. So let's get into some of the details of TSM version 6. With the TSM database, DB2, we now have the active logs, a mirror, and the archive, what we call the archive log, and then a failover archive log, which is optional. Essentially, it's DB2. The way DB2 works is it just spreads the data across the file systems. You create the file systems, and then it fills them up. You no longer have to do your own DSM FMT commands to add volumes and then define those volumes to the DB. As long as the file system has space, it will continue to grow. So the trick is making sure that you allocate those file systems on the proper type of storage and the proper configuration. Sorry, question?
Do you still recommend splitting the DB2 database up into multiple volumes?
Yes, yes. Perfect question. So you want to have at least 4 LUNs, 4 to 8 LUNs that would have its own file system and directory for DB2, because DB2 will use separate I/O threads across those mount points. We've seen customers just put one directory up, and it hasn't worked that well. We've seen the best performance on anywhere from like 4 to 8 mount points for the underlying DB2 database.
Yes. In DR,
yes,
because some people don't have replication here. With the multiple threads coming up on the database, when you go to restore, will it be in serial, or it's can use it will be simultaneously mounting 4 drives? Let's say you use 4 threads. You're going to be using 4 drives to restore the database, or you're going to use 1 drive in serial,
right,
first, second, third, fourth.
So today in 6.2, you issue the same command, your backup DB, and it's a single thread.
Yeah.
What Warren was talking about, for performance, you're going to have multi-thread. Yeah. So it behaves just like it does today in version 5. It's one thread to one virtual volume or tape volume, and that would be the same for your restore process.
So in other words, if you took me 20 minutes to back up the database, it's going to take you 20 by 4 to restore that database.
Yeah, you're going to have the same performance with that you have with version 5 today, doing TSM version 6. Now the difference being, of course, is that we typically see that. Just focus on the last bullet here. We typically see the version 6 database grow anywhere from 30 to 50% larger than the version 5. In some instances, I've seen it maybe 5% or 0, but on average, I would say 30 to 50%. And it absolutely increases in size if you turn data deduplication on. And I think that's obviously why IBM decided to put the multi-thread in for the backup, because this thing was getting larger and larger, and using the same single thread process that you had in version 5, going back to that New York skyline, right? We weren't able to get that backup done within its window of time. It was spreading out longer and longer. Yes?
With regards to database growth and deduplication, if you're doing your deduplication at the source side, in other words, the TSM client, are we still impacting the size of the database on the target side?
Yeah, so the question is, if we're doing data deduplication on the source side, are we still impacting the size of the database? And we are. I've got some slides towards the end that'll talk about the interaction there on client side. So it's very important you figure out where the TSM database is going to live, because once you lay it down, it's very hard to move. It's not like it was with version 5, where you could easily reorganize it, move it from one storage array to another. You cannot delete the containers. So it's really important that you find the permanent home for this guy and make sure it's the optimal place for it to live in your storage infrastructure. You have two approaches that we've found. If you're going to add capacity, if you have to add capacity to your database, one is, in this example, you've got a 200 gig database and you want to add another 100 gig. You could do it by adding 2 more 50 gig volumes, i.e. mount points, and growing it that way. What happens, however, is DB2 will do an automatic reorg. He'll rebalance his containers across those new LUNs / file systems, which, by the way, I don't know if I mentioned that, you cannot use raw volumes any longer. You can still use raw volumes on the TSM storage pools, but you cannot use raw volumes for TSM version 6. So the other method that we prefer is just make sure you have enough space in those existing file systems to grow them vertically. That way, as the database needs space, he's claiming it from the file system, and you don't trigger any unnecessary reorganization. Of course, you're going to be running reorgs anyway over time, and that's another topic. But at least try to minimize what you're having to reorg. And then if you do want to use a SAN array like a DS8000, EMC, Hitachi, which most customers are putting their TSM internals on, particularly with TSM version 6, because of the size of the database and the logs, it's getting harder and harder to do it with internal drives, which you were usually able to get away with in version 5. So most of the time we see customers doing it externally, and then there's some best practices on the type of the controller and how you configure the storage and the cache. You can have one single LUN that would represent multiple disks within the array, but you still want to stick to a multi mount point configuration with multiple directories. DB2 will support up to 128 directories. It'll multi-thread across. And then there's some typically you can stay away from touching DB2, and IBM wants you to stay away from touching DB2. We usually get the question, oh, we have a DB2 DBA, should they get involved with this? And no, stay away, because it's a highly tuned beast. It's indexed and it's set up a certain way, and if you start messing with any of that underlying infrastructure, you're going to have problems. However, there are some things some DB2 commands you can run. They're posted on the wiki and on the website. So saying don't shy away from getting under the covers with it if you can do things to optimize your database for your environment. So the logs, big change here, right? We've got the active log, we got the archive log. Basically, the active log has all of the current transactions, and then it moves them into the archive log. And then that's managed by the containers in the active log are filled up. I think they're 512 megs, and then they copy over, right? They copy over the archive. It renames the sequence number on the active, and you keep going, and then until you do a database backup, TSM database backup that purges the archive log. You definitely want to mirror your active log, and you want to have that on very fast disk, and you want it mirrored, and you can do that with within TSM. It still supports the log mirroring, just not the database. So you don't have the database mirroring like we did in version 5. And this failover archive log, that's if the archive log itself fills up, which would be bad. What we found is just make the archive log big enough, and don't depend on the failover log, because I forget what the parameter is, but the interval of when it moves data from archive to failover is the interval may not keep up with the filling rate. So in other words, you still may run out of space in your archive log, even if you have a failover one defined. So that's been our approach. Just make it big enough to handle everything. This is real good news with version 6. Is instead of having a 12 gig, 13 gig on version 5, we have a 128 gig. Highly recommend you leave some extra room, just like you did in version 5, where you would make it only 12 gig instead of the full 13. In case you did max it out, you could go back in and restart it and not have to restore your database. Do the same thing. Lay down like an 8 gig dummy file, and that will make your life a lot easier. log consumption is the same. I mean, if you're consuming log space from the backups, I mean, you can consume more because now you can have more sessions and longer running jobs. And now with deduplication, that also consumes a lot of log space. So yeah, it seems like a big boost in real estate, but you still got to be careful, and therefore leave a little buffer there, because if it does fill up, it will halt, and you'll be unhappy. On the archive log, I'd be generous. 500 gig to a terabyte. There are some formulas to help you figure out exactly where you should be, but as a rule of thumb, 500 gig to a terabyte, I think would get you in the safety zone. Because the way it works is it only purges itself after 2 backups of the TSM database. That's another thing. If you've been backing your TSM database up to tape, I would seriously consider starting to back it up to disk. Because if you have limited tape drives and that database does not get backed up, the log doesn't purge itself, and you're in a world of hurt. Yes?
Would you prefer to still keep the archive log one file system, or span that across multiples?
Good question. So the question is, would you want to keep the archive log one file system or multiple file systems? It can be one big file system. And it can be on slower media. So it could be like an NFS share. It doesn't have to be on a higher speed 15K SAS fiber channel disk storage like your database or your active log. And it could just be one large file system that you can grow. We had a customer that provisioned about 2 terabytes, saw they weren't using all of it, and they started to dump some data into that. Because what happened, apparently there's some threshold, I don't know what the number is, but when that file system gets filled, it starts doing database backups. So it thinks, oh, I'm going to run out of space, I guess it's like an auto protection mechanism, and all of a sudden this thing started running TSM backups at some strange time. We couldn't figure out why. It was because that file system was hitting a threshold. I don't know what the number is, but that's certainly something we ran into. Memory requirements, obviously with version 5, it wasn't too onerous. 12 gig without dedupe, 16 gig with dedupe. We've been recommending 32. A lot of these Intel boxes, I think, the increments are different. They start out at like 48, so we typically will round up if that's the option. Memory isn't too expensive, and you never know what you're going to need. The DB2 is a different beast, right? So memory can certainly help out if you have excess memory. And then if you're running multiple instances, it'll further drive that number up. And there's a command, db memory percents, that you can isolate how much memory each instance will consume on that same OS image.
On that command, is there any way to say, okay, if this instance is not using the memory, can the other one make use of it?
So the question is, with the db memory percent command, would it allocate memory based on usage? And that's not the case. I think that would have to occur within the operating system. For example, if you're using AIX LPARs with like a workload manager or something. But no, for that particular OS instance, it's a fixed percent.
Do you have a CPU requirement?
Yes. Thank you. Question is, do we have a CPU requirement? And the CPU requirements have increased, in particular for the deduplication. And the way it works is, and I'll get into it later, but essentially it runs a separate process, an admin process, and it is tied to the available CPUs. And that determines your rate of deduplication performance. So the faster and the faster the processors and the higher the quantity, the better off you are, particularly if you're going to be running any type of deduplication. We've seen some nice synergies with the Power 7 in DB2 using their symmetric multi-threading, and other jobs like the DB2 reorganization, which you never did with version 5, right? Because it didn't have that capability. That's why it would usually start to slow down after 120 gig or so, even though it could go up to 500 gig. So upgrade considerations. There's a utility that will help you with the upgrade process. It's a separate file that you got to get from the version 6 product. You obviously want to back up your version 5 database. It's recommended to launch it from version 5.5. You can do it from 5.4. It'll, under the covers, upgrade you to 5.5, but if you have a problem, it's harder to fall back. So we recommend just get you to 5.5 because it removes the code after the fact. That's an in-place upgrade. But if you remember back to that first chart, the other path to take was to do a net new setup, and now you don't have this danger. If something goes down with your version 6, you can always fall back to your version 5 system. And you can synchronize the two through the export-import. We've had customers put in a new version 6, and they'll do an upgrade, and then test it out, run version 5, and then sync the two with the export-import process between the two systems. So there are restrictions, right? You can't merge. I got a lot of customers that have 3, 4, 5 instances of TSM version 5. There's no way to upgrade that. So we talked about the log and how it flows. It's copied over to the archive, and then it's renamed on the sequence number. This kind of gives you a visual on what's going on under the covers. So the key here is just to keep the logs flowing, which means keeping that database backup occurring to ensure that you're pruning the archive log and not filling up and running out of an out-of-space condition. So I think by default, DB2 reorg is turned on, and there's a lot of threads. There was actually one just this week, I think, about the reorganization process. So you want to just pay attention to that. You may want to control it like you would other admin processes. You may want to run that instead of whenever it decides to run it on the weekends or once a month or whatever interval makes sense for you.
Where's that documented? Would that be in the admin doc?
No, these are on the wiki. There's a lot of updates. Yeah, this is kind of post admin guide flash news.
Delete admin.
Yeah. So backing up the database, as I said earlier, it's the same command. They simply linked the command through the TSM API, which is important for DR when you're doing a restore. You got to have you should have that API there, because when it's backing up, you'll see it as a session where you never saw that before with version 5. You'll see it as a session, so don't kill it because it's your backup job. And if you can, use the wizard to do. If you use the wizard to set it up, it defines all of this node name and the syntax, the variables for the node and the password. If you don't use the wizard, you have to do it by hand. It's not a big deal, but some extra steps as part of the setup process. And here's just the how it flows. As we said earlier, it's a single stream. So I spent some time in the 6.3 beta program, and the backup DB was pretty impressive with the multi-stream. It was just like Oren's chart said, very I don't know, it was 70% faster. It was a significant improvement on throughput we were seeing. Let's see, so you have the full and the incremental. That's one thing I noticed is with version 5, you would do a backup DB, it was a full. Here you have to specify a full. So you have to use type equals full. If you don't, you're not going to get any pruning of your archive log. Now, some customers, they would start off with they're just using the same script, and it turns out that now they were doing only incremental backups, and that wasn't pruning anything, and then they ran out of space, and they had to add that parameter. So let's talk about deduplication. I think this is one of the most exciting features of TSM version 6. Number of advantages, right? Reducing your storage capacity. We talked about the capacity licensing. Okay, when the macro checks for the storage pool, it's checking after deduplication. So if I can get 3 to 1, 4 to 1, if I can go from a petabyte down to 300 terabytes, that feature has saved me a lot of money, right? Hundreds of terabytes potentially. The only way you can have, the only other way you can have deduplication save you money is if you use IBM's Protect Tier VTL. And in that case, they'll count the physical storage. So in other words, let's say I've got 100 terabytes of physical capacity, and it's really 600 terabytes. Right? So when I run the command, it's going to come back and say 600 terabytes. It's only in the TSM dedupe that it shows after dedupe. So it's showing the hydrated amount. But IBM will say, oh, for Protect here, we'll only charge you for the 100, the physical capacity. But if you're using Data Domain, Falcon Store, or anyone else, you're going to pay for the hydrated amount. So something to think about if you're looking at VTLs and capacity-based pricing. So we've seen it, right? Everyone wants to keep more data on disk, faster backups, faster restores, and this is the way to do it efficiently. Network bandwidth savings, client-side deduplication. So I've had a lot of customers over the years running compression because they didn't have enough network bandwidth to do their backups, whether it was either local on the LAN or across the WAN. Now with the client-side dedupe, you can filter out the data before it's sent to the TSM server. And it's global. Right? So if I back up my laptop, notepad.exe, that goes to a TSM storage pool A, right? And then Oren backs up his laptop, notepad.exe. It will realize that it's already in storage pool A, and it'll just reference his file. It will not send it across the wire. Now, this is where you have to use TSM disk pools. So this is where client-side or TSM dedupe would be mutually exclusive to a virtual tape dedupe device. But I do have customers that use both. For example, they'll have Protect here in the data center doing the LAN backups on the dedupe, and then for their WAN, they're using the client side and using TSM disk pools. So some of the trade-offs, where's the tax? Right? No free lunches these days. It's a tax on the CPU, but the idea is if you've got the cycles, why not use them? It's kind of an interesting discussion because when 6.1 came out, it was server-side, target dedupe. So the question was, well, when would I not use the server side and use something like a protect tier? And the thought process was, well, if you're backing up more than 3-4 terabytes a night, you should probably go outboard because you won't have enough time in the day to process 3 to 4 terabytes worth of backup data. A lot of it had to do with how many engines you had in your server too. But now when you think about it, the clients are doing the heavy lifting, right? They are the ones that are chunking up the files, creating the hash signature, and then of course communicating with the TSM server. So I think it changes the game significantly if you're looking at dedupe and you have a high volume backup environment. But you definitely have to look at what's going on upstream because if you are doing encryption, encryption really waters down the dedupe. If in that example I gave you before, another reason to start using the TDPs is because what I've found is the DBAs that write back up to the local disk are using compression on our end because they're writing to tier 1 super fast disk and they're trying to save as much space as they can. Well, you're not going to get any dedupe effect there. And there's also best practices documented if you are using something like Oracle or DB2 because they do multi-stream backups, right? And they do what's called multiplexing, which can also disrupt the stream and water down your. Part of taking advantage of data deduplication is understanding how your business is being run today and what kind of practices you're doing, because you may have to introduce some changes.
So you're saying the database, Oracle database, for instance, will give you a high factor of dedupe rate than your regular backup? Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is, typically you will get a high dedupe from an Oracle database because you're doing fulls. Right? Where with TSM we always use the progressive incremental. But comparatively to like a net backup or a Commvault, on unstructured data the dedupe ratios are lower. But with databases we all have to back them up the same. We do fulls and incrementals. However, if the database backup is using compression or multiplexing, that could water down the dedupe effect on the Oracle backup. And therefore you may have to talk to the DBA about changing or modifying the way he's has his backup configured through RMAN, for instance. So advantages, we covered this, right? Conserving network bandwidth. It's global on the client side. It does consume CPU cycles. Backups may take longer. Okay, I mean that's one thing we've seen because now you're spending time figuring out what's duplicate and what isn't. And there's still a computational tax on the TSM server. That does not mean you're not going to be able to get away with upgrading or putting more processors in your TSM server if you're using client-side dedupe. It's just you're going to have less CPU consumption than if you're having your clients do the dedupe versus the TSM server. So the client side is what we call in-band. The data is being deduped effectively as it's being read. So we're reducing network and storage costs. The out-of-band approach is the server side, where the data lands on disk and then we run what's called the identify process. So typically what we like to do is make that landing zone very fast disk, like 15K SAS fiber channel, because what happens with the identify process is you're reading these blocks very fast, and if you're on the slower SATA 7200, it slows down. So have that landing zone run the identifiers, and the number of identify processes is based on how many CPUs you have available. And then you can either migrate the data from that fastest to slower, and that will filter out, that will do the dedupe process and filter out the duplicate database and do all these lookups for that particular operation. It's just something we've observed. Copying data, like doing backup storage pool commands from a dedupe disk to, say, physical tape, no problem. But a migration from a dedupe pool to a non-dedupe pool will put a significant load on your TSM server. So you want to make sure you've got enough storage there. It all depends on the number of CPUs, and there are some benchmarks on what you can expect as far as megabytes per hour that you can dedupe, you can identify at, and then of course you'll filter it out through your admin process. And there is a file size limit. The default is 50 gig. So the idea is that large files you may not want to use the client-side dedupe. You can up that value, but 50 gigs is the limit. So parting thoughts, right? If you're still on version 5, make the move. It's time. It's solid. It's working well. A lot of benefits. Everything seems to run faster. Use it as an opportunity to bring in new hardware. You can get better performance. Do an assessment. See if you have to do any remediation. If you're going to the well for infrastructure, make sure you're addressing all of the pain points. Revisit the SLAs. Make sure you're going to be able to meet those recovery objectives of the organization. Definitely look at an archiving strategy. It's a tough conversation. Data preservation is just one of those things where just keep shoving it into TSM, set no limits for the management classes, and everything will be fine, right? And that's what people have been doing for years. But it's creating a lot of pressure, and can particularly cost you a lot of money now with the Unified Recovery Suite. Do testing. There's a lab available. It's a great sandbox. All of those products on that Unified Recovery Suite you can test out. Virtual lab, you can go in, you can play with Fastback. I think the best way to evaluate whether something's going to be relevant to your infrastructure is to test it out and see how it behaves. See how much faster I can recover Exchange with Fastback for Exchange, or evaluate HSM to see if I can move unstructured data off my primary storage. And if you're interested in any of that, just send me an email. And with that, questions?